For Robert Johnson, very well-known musician. Um, a lot of people look at him as one of the most popular Delta blues musicians. We talked about Charlie Patton last time, who was definitely a big time, pretty well-known Delta blues musician, maybe even more well-known as far as pop music goes during his time. Robert Johnson was really not discovered till after his time as far as the popular music scope, as I was saying. But locally and among musicians, he was known during his time. And as I'll mention later, just very influential. He doesn't really carry some of the titles that the other musicians had, like Godfather of the Blues, King of the Blues. A lot of those are kind of self titles, almost marketing tools, but a lot of it was just because he wasn't necessarily recognized. And that's one of the reasons why there was so much legend and lore surrounding him, because so much of his life is unknown. But for example, the first photograph of Robert Johnson didn't emerge until sometime in the 1980s, and I believe, I'm not sure when, but just recently, not that long ago, there was a third photograph, which is there's three total photographs that have been like verified that are of Robert Johnson. So that kind of tells you the limited information surrounding his life. And at this point, like I mentioned with some of these other older artists, it's hard to say if anything else will come out. Um, One of the things that characterized Robert Johnson's music and also built on the lyrics is that his music had a very dark character, a dark sense. A lot of the lyrics were pretty dark, which is not too outside of the realm of Delta blues. It was a, a rural music that really discussed some of the hardships and difficulties that the musicians and the communities were going through at the time. And a lot of that was expressed in the music. Not always, not necessarily. And even for Robert Johnson, it wasn't. I think it may have been a little bit overplayed and kind of just played into this whole narrative of Robert Johnson and this darkness and his dealings with the devil and the crossroads and him selling his soul, which is, I'll get into a little bit more, but that is what he's really well known for, um, at least later on. Um, and one of the reasons people said that is because early on in his career, he played with Son House and supposedly had some encounters with Willie Dixon. I mean, Son House and Willie, they played together. It was well known. When I talked about Charlie Patton, Son House was one of the people who was influenced and played with Charlie Patton a bit, and so that kind of follows that lineage to a certain extent. But when Son House was playing with Robert Johnson, Robert Johnson was just kind of getting started playing, maybe doing some backup work and just trying to get involved. And at the time, he was not, according to Son House and others, he was just not up to par, or he's just playing in a way that just did not work with their music, and at least in their perspective, it was not quality or good playing, and so he quickly left that scene, and that would have been when he was in Mississippi in his early playing days. And then the reason it kind of builds up is when he resurfaces, all of a sudden he's a really good player, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But as far as his character and dark character, there are definitely, I think there's truth to that. But if you listen to one of the more recent interviews by his stepsister, her last name is, I believe, Anderson. I forget her first name, but she kind of really it was really recent, within the last 5 or 10 years, I believe. She's 94, so it's actually very fortunate that we were able to get that kind of information at this point from someone, one of his relatives, later on. And one of the things that she meant to influence it was just some of the older narratives that she did see of portraying him in this kind of dark way, trying to kind of fulfill this legend about him. And she kind of adds a little bit of the other side where he's a little bit more joyful. The photograph he's in is a little bit more. It wasn't necessarily joyous, but it wasn't kind of the dark kind of uh, really stoic kind of pictures, subdued pictures that were out previously. But she says that he was a much more positive, upbeat individual, and counter to a lot of the ways portrayed in movies and in the picture. A lot of time he liked to dance and move around in his performances, which is kind of counter to the way it's portrayed as kind of just sitting on the stool or chair and just playing, smoking like a cigarette, I think, is usually what goes on, and singing from there and kind of playing this eerie sort of crossroads Delta blues music, um, which definitely there's songs that definitely reflect that, but that kind of adds another narrative. And there are songs, like I think when you think about Sweet Home Chicago, there are songs that definitely play to something else than those other songs that illustrate that narrative. But at the same time, if you look into some of Robert Johnson's history and how his life was shaped, his stepsister also doesn't really deny or try to say, oh, some of this other stuff didn't happen, but she wanted to add these other components. Um, because when you go back, his first wife, there was like a tragic story where his first wife died in childbirth, giving birth to his first child. Both of them died, and I think you can imagine that was, could that right there could have contributed a lot to his playing style, because this was really before his transformation into a good player. So that would have definitely shaped a lot of it. He was known for drinking a little heavily, so a lot of the stuff can all play together, in various forms of trauma. And it's not like far off to think, oh, this is what shaped maybe some of his writings or his character, or if sometimes he was a little bit down. Stories like that could definitely do it. And I think another one of the reasons that could have been downplayed is because as a performer, as an entertainer, touring around, he was known to favor married women, relationships with married women. So I think if you kind of have that reputation, or people inflate that reputation, maybe that can take away from the relationship and that early loss that he experienced with his first wife and child, which definitely could have shaped it. Another interesting thing, actually, in regards to that, I have to look at my notes to get this straight, because it's a little bit confusing. But when he was born, his mother, he was born to his mother and another man. His mother was currently married to another individual, and they remained married, but the guy she was married to was he had to leave Mississippi and go to Memphis due to some other kind of conflict that was not related to them. And so eventually his mother and him moved to live with this guy in Memphis, well, her husband still in Memphis, and her husband was with another mistress at the time. And so they all lived in that situation for a few years, until eventually his mother left that situation and remarried to another man, and he eventually went to live with them as well. So you can see how, you know, as far as modeling and marriage and relationships, how that kind of got a little bit convoluted and different. So that could have changed how you viewed marriage too. So that's just, kind of side stories. But, I think it's important to consider some of these things when, especially going backwards to those times and the way black life may have been portrayed. I think with a lot of these individuals who aren't well documented, some of the lore and legends, when you think about how black people were described, sometimes it becomes, very almost mythical, but very it's very flavorful, and a lot of fiction and lore is kind of thrown in there, consistent with some of the things that were said at the time that weren't necessarily positive and not necessarily true. You may have taken a few instances, extreme instances, and expanded those and used those to color a lot of different individuals in not a great light. And in the case of Robert Johnson, I think his stepsister put it well as far as not necessarily disagreeing with some of the stuff that's out there, but also adding some of the stuff. And I think that's the case for Robert Johnson and some of his legends and dealings with the devil. Even though, even for me, sometimes I don't completely dismiss it, but I generally would ascribe to some of these other more grounded stories that have come out. So, Robert Johnson, after the tragedy with his first marriage, he traveled around a bit, and he ended up going to southern Mississippi, where he was tutored and met Ike Zinnerman. And Ike Zinnerman is known to be his primary mentor during this period where he was really focusing on guitar. And another component of that was he got remarried to a much older woman. I mean, comparatively older, by I think like 10 years or something. And she was very supportive of his music career and, really allowed him to kind of explore that, and also being mentored by Ike Zinnerman. And one of the things that kind of, I guess, contributed to the lore, I think to some degree, is Ike Zinnerman was rumored or known to enjoy practicing guitar late at night while sitting on tombstones. So that's kind of a interesting detail. I think, if you want to think about like the whole devil narrative, like, oh, he's learning from this guy who likes to stay in the graveyards and sit on tombstones and practice, which is a little bit odd. But, I think in rural life, small town life, certain things are just done differently. And, I think the outdoors is viewed differently. Sitting in the graveyard is a little bit odd, but at the same time, you could also think of it as a spiritual way. If you're, depending what your roots are, I think people view those things differently. So I don't know, but it's interesting. And regardless, he that whole period of time where he was able to focus on music and really practice a lot and get tutored by Ike Zinnerman, who was really early Delta blues man in his own right. He eventually returned to northern Mississippi with these new skills and really wild people, and that period of time would have been the time where people are saying like, oh, he sold his soul at the crossroads and made a deal, and that's how he became a great guitarist, which, it's a little bit of a stretch, I think. But I don't want to completely, dismiss it and, if that's I know he's famous and well known, so I don't want to, if that's the narrative that you like, stick to it. Uh, so as after that, is when his career began, and he began to tour, mostly based in like northern Mississippi and Arkansas, and he started to travel a little bit more through like the Midwest and all the way through I think to the East Coast also, Northeast, Midwest, Northeast, the kind of the usual route that people would take at the time, moving up the Mississippi and heading east at some point. Um, and he influenced quite a few musicians at the time. Howlin' Wolf, who was also a big, was inspired by Charlie Patton, Sonny Boy Williamson, Elmore James, pretty well known uh, blues musicians who, came up shortly after. Um, and so, just I guess digging a little bit more into the legend of Robert Johnson and the Crossroad Blues, which was one of his first hits when so he never really got discovered by the industry. He toured around, gained some popularity. He definitely was known by other up and coming musicians, and the main success or commercial success, industry success that he got him two recordings. There's only two known recordings, professional recordings of him, and they were both done by ARC, which is the American Record Corporation, and it evolved into, I don't remember if it was Columbia Records, I want to say. But regardless, it was in Texas. One was in Dallas, one was in San Antonio, consecutive years, one year after the other. And he recorded the basically the only recordings that are known of him. They're not the greatest recordings. One of them was done in the makeshift studio, so I'm not sure. It wasn't a mobile unit. I think it was. There are other artists who recorded there, so I'm not sure what quality it was. But if you listen to the recordings, they're not great in comparison to some of the other recordings at the time. Nothing was incredible at the time, but they don't sound as good as others. And so one of his hits is Crossroad Blues, which was later reworked and is Crossroads by Eric Clapton. It's one of the big ones. But the Crossroad Blues is what people really point as to emphasize the legend of Robert Johnson and the whole deal with the devil. But if you listen to the song Crossroad Blues, there's definitely alternative interpretations and also in well, I'll talk about that in a second. Um, so if you listen to the song, he's really alluding to feeling unsafe or uncomfortable in a unknown area at the crossroads of a major road highway, and you have to go consider the times. This is the 1930s, so in Mississippi, and as a black man, you know being in an unknown area where people don't know you. This is during Jim Crow laws, although in Mississippi, a lot of the Jim Crow laws they didn't really. Basically, Jim Crow laws were not necessary in Mississippi just because it was already very not it was unnecessary. There's a lot of okay. So for example, in Mississippi, during the Jim Crow law era, there were 539 lynchings, which was the most, you know, comparatively among states. So, and so basically, what I'm trying to say is the Jim Crow laws weren't necessary because there's already forms of enforcement, local enforcement that were going on to oppress and, you know, control black people during that era. Um, so, anyways, that point also illustrates the potential feelings of concern that Robert Johnson would have had standing at the crossroads in an unknown area where either the police can come or somebody can come along and question what you're doing. Feel fearful, or they're going to put you in jail and put you to work. Or worse. That's almost a best case scenario. If you're encountering certain people in Mississippi. So that just that alone would explain what he was getting at when he was talking about the Crossroad Blues. Um, another another example I think you can get at is, I think when you think about if him preferring married women was indeed fact or true, then you could see that uh, him being concerned about just those actions can see how it can lead to him being concerned about uh, being encountered, or dealing with the devil, or kind of like devil's work, playing with fire type scenario. And you could also just some people have a very historically spiritual connection with crossroads, depending what culture you're coming from. Crossroads can be a big component in their spirituality, specifically. I know specifically referring to um, some some spiritual connections that crossroads is used a lot, or language equivalent to crossroads in like West Africa is used a lot. I don't know. Obviously, there's a lot surrounding this song. A lot is unknown, and he's not here to explain it, so it would be speculation. But I think any of those could kind of provide an alternative to the legend that kind of goes along with that song.